On the 12th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 12 Drummers, or Unlikely Friends, an original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Once upon a time, in a land far away and forgotten by all who still draw breath, there was a town without neighbor or friend, and whose residents had long forgotten how they came to be there. But they were happy to be there, for they had their own customs and ways, their own times and celebrations, and their own trials and dangers, which kept them locked in the borders of their little town. Mostly. Now, earlier in the week past, Ezra Cunningham, now well grown to manhood, had declared from the town centre that he was due to wed the young Sabrina Michelson, with whom he'd fallen into love. With this news he also declared the marriage would happen 7 days hence, and take place over another 7-day feast. And on the final day, all the people were to bring drums, bought or made, great and small, and play the old tune, Feet on the March, which was said to have gone up before the final victory of manfolk and woodsfolk against the old ones. Thus a boy of 19 set out through the town in search of drums, but they were all bought up in the hour that Lord Ezra had made his declaration. Then he and his 10 siblings scoured the market for materials to make their own drums, finding much the same dilemma. They tried barter and begging, but there wasn't a scrap left to make one's own instrument, for the townsfolk had grown exceedingly in the years past, so there were now too many people in need of the same, blessed in the harvest and births under the guidance of Lord Cyrus and Ezra, both, and their ward Lord Michael Allen, and in-law Jasper Fisher. Desperate for the supplies to craft the required drums for his family, the boy and his 3 brothers devised to hunt in the woods and skin their catches, one for each point of the compass. Thus in the east wood, marking the eastern border of the town beyond Fisher Fields, the boy of 19, Joshua Morgan, stalked the tracks of a deer. He'd begun his hunt in the dark of morning, but only found the trail 10 minutes prior, under the risen sun. The prints weren't deep or broken up, the pace even but quick. There was no blood or broken brush, nor even fur on any passing tree or bush, but it showed no signs of slowing. So Joshua kept his eyes open for the signs and sprinted in simple leather skins tied to his feet to better soften his steps. His bow was strapped to his back and quiver bound to his thigh and tied shut. He made no noise, even as he leapt into a trot. Eventually he stopped at the base of a huge tree, panting silently as he could, breath beginning to come as mist before his face. It wasn't cold enough for snow, but soon the ground would be blanketed white, hopefully after the wedding feast. He unlatched the uppermost ivory buttons through their catches to pull his thick coat open to his chest to keep from sweat, the furs inside sticking to his bare arms and throat as he studied the ground. Finding the tracks again, he followed, weaving between the trees for another 30 minutes. The creature showed signs of slowing as it wove aimlessly around the wood. Joshua furrowed his brows, but kept pace. Why ever it acted thusly, it was more opportunity to catch up. Another 20 minutes took him northeast, but before he could consider that he might happen upon Swan Lake, something rustled a little ways away. He slowed, rising onto tiptoe as he pulled the bow from his shoulder and opened his quiver to knock. He stalked behind the trunk of a massive tree, old as the town or more, and perked his ears after a snorting breath on the other side. His heart quickened, beating in his ears and temples, making his fingers sore as the heat and cold and burn in his lungs went numb. He took a silent breath, eyes going hard and fixed as a hawk as he let it out and carefully positioned himself around the side of the tree. The stag was smaller than he'd hoped, but it would do. Then he stared longer than he'd meant, when he found the full rack of antlers standing tall and unmarred. He scolded himself. It didn't matter why it still had its antlers, just more for wears. He only needed the hide. "I'll not see them shamed," he thought. "Let me be without a drum to honour the marriage, but not them. Let them make merry." Then he pulled the bow with a careful breath and exhaled, finding the creature's heart and waiting until he was perfectly still to loose. But as it flew, the stag stepped back, so when the arrow struck, it sunk into its shoulder. Joshua peeled his lips back in a snarl and knocked another arrow as the stag screamed, high and broken as an elk. He leapt from behind the tree, face twisted into something fierce, and loosed the arrow, but the motion skewed his aim, so the shaft sunk into its side. He cursed and knocked another before he'd even righted to his feet, pulling back as the stag stumbled like a fawn and fell over by a tree, legs thrashing as its cries changed. Joshua furrowed his brows as the cold blood of the hunt faltered. He lowered the bow and slacked the string, feet still in stance as he stared at the creature, its head raised and eyes wide when they found him. There was something to that gaze, something not of a stag, something knowing or familiar. Then it opened its mouth with a man's scream as cloven hooves pushed it back into the tree. Joshua stepped back, swallowing as the stag hissed with squeezed eyes when it tried to push with its short leg. It huffed and cried out before it went half still. Groaning, it raised its head back up. "Don't loose," the stag said. Joshua leapt back, bow raised and arrow ready. "No," the stag ordered, almost a plea. "I'm no animal, I'm a man. Don't kill me." Joshua, swallowing, took another step back and lowered the bow enough that he could raise it to shoot in an instant if he needed. He eyed the creature, both panting steam, blood rushing in Joshua's ears. "What are you?" Joshua hissed, jerking the bow up. "Speak, seeing as you can." "I'm a man, a lord's son. Do not loose another arrow, hunter." The stag swallowed, trying to right itself again and wincing at the wound in its shoulder. It slumped back down with a growling huff before his green eyes, human eyes, glared up at Joshua. "Why have you shot me, hunter? The first I can excuse for my appearance, but the second? You heard my voice, boy. Should you loose a third, I'll have you taken before the woods folk for trial." Its face moved with human emotion, something unnatural on a stag's head, yet it did so as though it should. Joshua clenched his jaw, bow dipping as he stared at the stag's face, the strangely human face. "Prove to me you're a lord, and not some devil thing cooked up this far into the wilds." The stag scoffed and spat. "Me, a wild thing." He cursed in a different tongue before continuing. "I am Levi Baal, son of Matthias, son of Abram. Mine is the house of many sons." "And your crest?" Joshua said, voice flat, hands trembling. "Two swords crossing over a field of yellow and black motley, surrounded by a rose wreath." The stag gave his words gently, as if persuading Joshua to be calm, though his eyes still burned like he would plant his antlers in the man's gut if he could. Your look?" "My look?" the stag said, then laughed and quickly winced from the arrow in his side. He found the shaft and sneered before his head sunk in a tired sigh, and he shook his head with a shut eye. "The Baals are short but broad, with brown curls and eyes of green or blue. We also are seconded in our fairness only by the Cunninghams." The stag opened his eyes as if tired, but not dismissive, finding Joshua's and licking velvet lips. "I am Levi Baal, a man, not a beast." He looked through the wood, then found Joshua again. "I am here without my family's blessing for my own purposes, but take me to them and I'll see you looked after as thanks." "My family's in no need of the help of your folk." Joshua picked up his lips in a half-snarl. then sighed and dropped his arms, sliding the arrow back into the quiver and cursing as he turned round. He squeezed the grip of the bow, swinging as if to throw it into the woods before he groaned and slouched. "We aren't destitute, understand?" Joshua asked. "I never implied you were. Many a family hunts on the border for food and sport alike. There's no shame in it, boy." "Joshua," he said, turning around with a tired face and heavy arms. "Call me by my name if you address me, Lord Stag." The stag, Levi, snorted. "You believe me, then? Even if you're a liar, what kind of man would I be if I killed a thinking thing just to make a drum?" Joshua shouldered his bow and wiped his hands down his face with a growl that turned to breath as he knelt before the stag. It moved uncomfortably, but kept watching Joshua's face. "Lord Ezra's edict sent you here. I'll not hurt you. Hold still and I'll treat these enough for you to walk until you can reach greater medicines, seeing as you're a lord." He turned the last into a goad of sorts, refusing the stag's eye as he settled the crook of his thumb against the shaft in its shoulder. "And yes, now hold still. The head's got no teeth, so it'll come easy." Then, as the stag opened his mouth to protest, Joshua gripped the shaft and jerked it free with a trickle of blood briefly bridging arrow and wound. Levi shouted in a mix of beast and man, jerking back, legs going rigid, then thrashing, then rigid, as his face curled up in pain before shooting back at him in anger. "You could have given me some warning, dullard!" Joshua chuckled. "You're welcome. Brace yourself." Then he gripped the other and unsheathed it with half the movement from Levi and double the scream. He smirked and set the arrow aside to pull the herbs and ointment from his medicine bag on the hip opposite his quiver. He mixed the dry herbs and the ointment in his bare palm and stuffed it into each wound, pulling as many curses from Levi's mouth as he pushed medicine in. "Come, Lord Stag, to your feet. Or hooves. Very funny. With these wounds? They're shallow, and the herbs help with pain. Stand before they wear off, will you?" Levi sighed and shook his head. "Have you a spot of twine?" "Yes, why?" "Get it for me, so I can cover my nakedness, will you?" He barked, then shut his eyes with a deep breath. Before Joshua could ask what he meant, the stag changed. The bones didn't shift under the skin. There was no mist or twinkle or illusion. The pelt simply lifted at the seams down the arms and legs, the underbelly and throat, and came away loose as a coat. The stag shifted, pelt flopping away with bare pale skin beneath, until it came loose from the legs to reveal human ones going straight out as Levi groaned. Then again with his stretching forelegs, now arms, until his head bucked backward with a long gasp and slowly came forward as a man's head and neck. He panted with a groan as he rolled onto his belly, face to the side in the undergrowth, with a deer pelt laying over his back. The man, no more than 21, tightened his mouth and groaned as he pushed himself up against the tree, pulling the pelt between his legs with his good arm, the other held tight to his chest with a pained face. Then he opened his eyes on Joshua's slack mouth and smirked despite the obvious discomfort, before checking his wounds in his muscled shoulder and slender waist. "You did good work," the man said in the same voice as the stag, brushing long brown curls from his face. "Will you help me stand? I thought it easier like this." Joshua stared, eyes going up and down the man, Levi, until the other laughed. "Come now, old boy, don't grope me with your eyes. Help me up." Joshua shut his mouth with a click of teeth and stood, hands hanging heavy and dumb at his sides as he looked Levi over. Short, like he'd said, with brown hair and green eyes, like he'd said. He was just darker than snow, with no freckle on his hairless skin, and muscled like a smith. He found the pelt and furrowed his brow when he realized it was nearly the same color as his hair. Then he shot back to Levi's face and licked his lips, stepping back when the other raised a hand for help. "What are you?" Joshua took another step. "I'm a simple man. From a simple family, we have no want of magic or trickery." "And you'll have none, I swear." "I have half a mind to leave you here." A stag! His eyes drifted until he stared through the world and into his own imagination. Joshua, Levi said before he winced at the sudden jolt of his ribs. He grabbed the wound on his side. Joshua, I'm not a sorcerer or a woodsman or of the old folk. I'm just a lord's son. Then how? Joshua stepped forward, fists balled and face hot as he stared Levi down. Explain, or I'll leave you here to hunt another pelt. Or I'll just take that and leave you naked in the cold. Levi's pained face turned dark, and his green eyes blazed like strange fire as he subconsciously gripped his pelt. You will do no such thing, boy. I'll die before you take my skin. It isn't a part of you, is it? Joshua smirked. It is. We lordlings are tried to become men with the woods folk. Levi held his glare, body going taut like a snake ready to strike. And those who pass earn the pelt of the stag they become for the ritual. Joshua furrowed his brow and went to say something, but Levi continued. You wanted to know? Then shut your teeth and listen, boy. The pelt's alive and as much a part of me as the skin you see now. The gift of transformation lasts long as the pelt's kept safe. Take this and make it into a drum, and you'll inflict pain upon me like you flay me alive. Joshua smiled with a puff of a laugh, the last attempt to make it all a joke, before he stood still and flitted his eyes over Levi, swallowing when the air grew too thick. You saw me change. No? Shall I return? What proof more need you? Levi balled his fists and struck the ground before he winced and looked up with a tired sigh. Take me to the bales, and they'll prove my tale. Take me there, and I'll see you get your drums. Joshua swallowed, eyes fixed to Levi's face. Only drums? Levi smirked. I thought you had no need for help from my folk. Joshua stepped forward, hand reaching for his bow. Levi raised a hand with a smile. Peace. I shouldn't goad you. Take me home, and I'll tend my wounds. Say nothing of where you found me, and I'll grant you whatever number of instruments you wish, and whatever more you need. Need, mind you. Joshua thought a moment, then sighed with a nod, pulling a length of twine from his bag as he approached and pulled Levi onto his feet with a hissing groan from the stag man. He kept well enough on his feet and wrapped the pelt around his waist, tying two of the legs together at his hip with the twine and wincing. He pulled his hand away and shook it, flexing the fingers. Are you well enough? Joshua asked, as he pulled two lengths of cloth from his bag and wrapped Levi's shoulder and waist until the wounds were covered so the ointments wouldn't seep too badly. Like I said, the pelt is as much my skin as this. He motioned his forearm. What is done to it, I feel. It's strange, I grant you. Bizarre seems a better word. Levi smiled with a nod. Yes, I suppose so. Shall we? I've become lost in these woods. I'm still learning my way. Come, I've marked the trees. Joshua motioned with his head and strode to keep Levi at his right shoulder, eyes peeled in the daytime woods and ears perked for the subtlest, unseemly act from the stag man. One move, and I could just harm his pelt. He doesn't seem to be lying about that, at least, he thought. We'll see about the rest. They walked in tense silence for several minutes, Joshua keeping his head on swivel to scour the woods for prey so that he wouldn't be the only one to return empty-handed, feet padding silently, ears twitching. But the eastwood was silent as Joshua and Levi, like the whole of the ancient wood was sleeping, even the wind. Resolved to find nothing on the return, Joshua shouldered his bow and sealed up his quiver, but left the strap on the blade undone if he needed to raise it against the other. If you're a lord, Master Stag, then what would bring you alone into the East Wood? Joshua didn't find the other's face. I said there was no shame in hunting food, didn't I? Hunting in the body of a deer. Most wise. Joshua smirked derisively, but still kept his eyes off the man's face, checking for his marks in the trees.
"Planned you to set yourself as bait for a bear?"
"There isn't a bear for miles."
"Fine. What were you hunting then?"
"An animal."
"Have you a preference?"
"The edible kind."
"Like you to be so vague."
Joshua stopped and faced Levi as the stag man adjusted the pelt round his waist.
"Need you root up my business like a boar?"
They stared at one another, each waiting for the other to relent, but neither did. Joshua just smiled.
"You're bad at keeping secrets, Lord Stag."
"My name is Levi Bale," he ground between his teeth.
"Never answering in full, and always so bluntly steering me off the question. What a way to tell me you have a good reason for being here."
"Drop it, peasant." He stalked forward, cheeks going pink as he looked for Joshua's marks. "It's a matter unfit for you." Joshua snickered and followed, arms crossed as a breeze crashed into their right, worming into his half-open coat and tossing Levi's pelt.
"Peasant, eh? I already mistrust you, Lord Stag. Insulting me won't put me off."
He followed Levi with a toothy, mischievous grin.
"What's got you so suddenly twisted?"
He caught up to Levi, whispering in his ear like he would to taunt his brothers.
"Did I interrupt a lover's meeting?"
Levi turned in an instant, face twisted like a gargoyle, as his arm came round and pounded his open palm to the side of Joshua's head, shoving him to the ground. "Shut your mouth!" he said over Levi, pale skin going pink and red from cold and rage, as he peeled back his teeth and set a bare foot on Joshua's chest, leaning down to grab his collar. Joshua plucked up his knife and grabbed the pelt, setting the point to the crook of throat and shoulder. Levi tensed and froze, eyes burning and face going dark as he growled his words. "Choose your actions wisely, boy. Pain is not wound." Joshua tightened his grip on the pelt and pushed the point in harder, just shy of piercing it. Levi's throat bulged with veins as he fought the urge to reel back. "You understand nothing. It isn't a game for you to play. This will cost a life should anyone know what we've done." Levi stood, foot going in Joshua's ribs as he jumped back, the blade scraping the pelt as he spun away, but there was no tear or cut.
"What is the matter with you?"
Joshua hissed as he stood, knife still in hand.
"Why should I help you for the promise of drums, of all things, when for all I know, you're a liar? And one to beat my skull, no less."
They faced one another again, both clenching fists as Levi flicked to Joshua's blade and back to his eyes.
"Try it, and I will wound you, not just that pretty rug."
Levi sneered and looked over his shoulder. He sighed angrily, reluctantly, and held out his hand. "I need you to lead me back. As payment, I'll give you part of my reason for being here, and once safely returned home, you'll be given instruments and whatever else you need." He eyed the knife. "Have we a bargain?" Joshua eyed him, thinking a moment.
"He's no weapons, but there's near enough meat on him for 2 men. Still, a knife cuts strong men much as it does weak." "That seems fine enough, but no lies."
Levi nodded, hand still out and face serious. "Open your palm with your blade, and then mine. We'll make an oath, and this shall be done under the old folk, so don't treat it lightly." Joshua looked between him and the knife and swallowed, before he nodded and brought the blade down his left palm with a hiss. He clenched his wounded hand and set the edge into Levi's palm, cutting him. Then they took hands with their fists raised between them to their chests, so the blood mingled and fell down their arms. Levi repeated his promise and payment, and Joshua repeated his promise of service, with Levi ending in a curse. "Or else your tongue fall limp, that you may never speak of this. Or else I go lame, to never see my heart again, nor enlarge my house." Joshua swallowed hard at that, but they both nodded and stepped away, wrapping their wounds in cloth, whilst Levi said he'd tell of his reasons for being in the wood while they walked. So Joshua led on. We lordlings are made men by running with the woods folk. Be there none to become men, they shall choose men to hunt us.
Hunt you?
As stags, Levi said as if it were obvious. In the end, those who become men of us are given pelts, and with it we might dress ourselves in the likeness of a stag, whither we will, yet keep our mind and voice.
All lords?
Those who succeed the trial. Many fail. Many succeed, though.
And the ladies?
Levi shook his head. Only the men. It's said to come from the old days, when man and woodsfolk made pact, a surrender of self to the nature of the other as a sign of brotherhood. Their leaders were all men, so we alone are offered the chance.
And you use this to wander the woods aimless? Or to find someone?
Levi's face went hard, throat flushing.
You mentioned your heart earlier.
The union of man and woodsfolk is now forbidden. The penalty is curse, at the whim of King Kahan and Lord Cyrus. Levi sighed, green eyes shimmering brighter than the dull, evergreen leaves. I have come to meet my wife in the east, away from our peoples. She's a woodswoman, and recently with child.
How does one wed a woodswoman without becoming a beast?
Joshua tried for a joke. Wed by our vows before an ancient ash, and the authority of the old folk, witnessed by the stars and beasts. We will flee before she swells with child. You see now how you have endangered her? Joshua's ears went hot, and he clamped his teeth uncomfortably.
And you cannot lie under our oath?
I still walk, no? Joshua swallowed and nodded.
I meant no harm to your wife.
Nor a lord, had I known. You were ignorant of me. Finish this and both of our families will be made right. Soon they found the tree line to Fisher Fields, along which they walked southward until they came upon an old rotted tree. Levi pulled out a large sack and dressed himself in the open, carefully folding the pelt and putting it into the bag. He adjusted his clothes, a simple cotton shirt under a long woolen coat with fitted trousers and traveling boots, and they crossed the flooded fields, taking marching way west and following the hammer north until a large manse stood up in the distance. Levi led them now, through a spot of pasture to a rocky outcropping that dropped several feet as the rest of the ground tapered to meet the gully. They went down the slope and found the grey rock face, Levi guiding them through a series of slender holes that were invisible when seen from the outside, eventually bringing them into a low cavern with carved walls and a door opposite them. They crossed the long chamber, and Levi produced a key from his coat pocket, unlocking it and the barred door on the other side. Then came the long trek through the dark, with only Levi's hand in Joshua's and the groping of walls to keep them straight. Eventually they found steps and took them carefully up, eventually finding a faint light that grew until they came into an antechamber of beige stone. It was barely large enough to fit 3 people, and had no discernible exit save the slits in the wall looking into a hall and a courtyard beyond. But Levi moved his hands about with a lever Joshua hadn't noticed earlier, and the wall pushed out and away on silent hinges.
Precautions left over from the war with the woodsfolk. Comes in handy when sneaking about,
Levi whispered, and Joshua agreed with a grin, nudging the other with his elbow as they stepped out, and the wall shut behind them, leaving no trace of its true nature.
You're starting to grow on me, Lord Stag.
Levi smirked, but only led him quietly through the halls, explaining his cousins would be training that time of day, leaving the house almost empty save the staff. But they were easily avoided by waiting behind corners or a statue or large potted plant until they came to Levi's chambers and breathed a sigh as the door shut and locked. Then he got to work rummaging through his desks and the shelves of books and the drawers of his bedside tables, setting sacks of coins on his lavish bed amid the room. He found Joshua and took a shoulder.
Those are for you. Stay here and lock the door behind me. I'll return when the horse is ready for you.
Horse? Joshua laughed. How else did you think you'd carry all the drums and else? Levi smirked, his eyes alight for the first time in something other than fire. Then he was gone, and the door locked, leaving Joshua alone in the chamber to pick through the books, all of their subjects and authors unknown to him. He sat on the bed, and his eyes rolled into his head as he slumped backward, arms outstretched with a deep sigh and chuckle as his body loosened and he melted into the soft cushions. He lay there for a little while, tempted to sleep, but curiosity pulled him up to investigate the still open desk and rifle amongst the papers neatly, lovingly, stacked to one side in the lowest drawer. He pinched a few pages, careful to keep them in order, and frowned a grin. On the paper was drawn a woodswoman, just as he'd always heard them described. Beautiful, antlers on their heads, legs of a doe. He was no great artist, Levi, but he captured the prettiness of the woman's face. Large eyes, high cheeks, strong jaw on a slender frame with a mess of curls in a nightgown. The drawings evolved the further he went. At first, different poses, then various stages of dress, until she was nude, and the poses something that made Joshua's face go hot. He quickly returned the papers and walked back to the bed to relax after all, but he didn't get much chance as someone rapped on the door and Levi whispered for him to open it. Joshua undid the lock, and Levi burst in, grabbing Joshua and his bags of coin with a hiss as his shoulder and pulling him through the holes like a lion were after their tails. Scarce a moment to breathe, Joshua didn't ask questions, just followed Levi through his family's manse, until they finally broke from the house to bolt along the outer wall and find the wooden stables. Panting, Joshua shoved Levi's good shoulder, staring at him.
"What on earth, man?"
"My cousins were looking for me. I'll have to find an excuse to keep from training, but you need to leave now. Edward, bring the horse." Levi motioned, and a man walked forward with a brown mare, saddled with bags hanging off her hips and shoulders. "Take her as part of my payment," Levi said, shoving Joshua on. "My sister can tend to my wounds. The oath is fulfilled. You needn't fret. Go, quickly, before my family catch you." Joshua mounted the horse, glad he'd learned to ride mules as a boy. "Thank you, Levi." He stuck out his cut hand, and Levi found it with his own and a firm shake. "And you." "Joshua Morgan." "Thank you, Joshua. Your house be made well. Now go." With a nod and smile, Joshua was gone, the mare driving him more than he her. Yet she didn't throw him, and he managed to slow her enough on the roads to keep eyes off himself, even managed to return home on the edge of the southeast quarter and direct the mare into the little stable beside their one-story brick house. He hopped off and led her into the only available stable, the other taken by their gelding, before his sisters swarmed around him, asking so many questions all at once that he couldn't understand them. He made them speak one at a time to answer them, what he could, but never gave so much detail to betray Levi his secrets. I vowed to keep them. I owe even Lord Stagg that much. But he did answer them, explaining that he'd come upon a stranger in the woods that repaid him handsomely for bringing him home with a mare and the prized drums. But his answers only brought more questions, so he pulled off the sacks of drums and handed them out. The girls ripped the bags open and all stared at the finely carved wooden frames, the clean stretched skin, the sparkling inlay and leather straps to play with both hands. They eventually pulled out sticks that matched the designs of each drum, some ivy, other trees, or birds, or lions, or dancing men. 13 in all, they found, passing around. One more than they would need. Thus, before the final day of the week, before Lord Ezra's wedding, the Morgans were able to fill every hand, their mother, the 4 boys, and 7 girls. They even kept the greatest and most beautiful of the drums upon their simple hearth in honor of their father and husband, Jacob Morgan. However, Joshua hadn't told his siblings of the gold. He only gave it in secret to his mother, that she could decide how the family might use what he'd call a small fortune. But Joshua wasn't the only one to return that night. His brothers had returned with a few catches of deer, badger, and boar, so they butchered the animals and feasted the days before the feast itself. And the day before the wedding, Levi found the Morgans and approached Joshua in secret, to ask after his family and if his payment had been suitable. Joshua asked after Levi's wounds and if he'd been found out. Both were well pleased with the other's answers. And in the days to come, Levi didn't leave them. He'd oft come in secret to Joshua through the course of the wedding feast, either at home or on the streets, hidden by the merriment, and together they began to joke and celebrate and play as though they were brothers, so that by the final day, Levi had found Joshua and stood a little ways away to keep hidden, instead of standing with his own family. The streets of the town were full. Everyone had come from house and tavern to play their drums. Some stood on roofs, others balconies. A few climbed the gutters and fences to look far into the town's heart. Joshua, though, couldn't see anything. But they'd brought crates for his sisters to stand on, and the horses. One of his brothers carted a few girls on Levi's mare, while his mother brought up a few more on their gelding, and that was fine. The smiles on their faces were better than whatever finery the Cunninghams wore. But then he found Levi in the crowd, closer now, so they could speak. He pulled his hood back slightly, a cloth pinned just right to hang over his simple clothes, and asked after Joshua's family. "We're well off because of you, you old stag." Joshua grinned wide. "I didn't think you'd give us that much gold." "I was in a rush." They chuckled. Then Levi leaned close. "I need to tell you this before the final toll. I'll need to be beside my family the rest of the day." "Speak, then." Joshua prompted him with a raised hand, ignoring one of his watchful brothers. "If your family should like, there are several positions of staff needs filling in my family's home. Should you want it, come after the feasting, and I'll meet you." Joshua found him with furrowed brows. "Why would you do this?" "I've seen your family these past days, and they're each hard workers, but I know there's hardly any paid work in the house. The staff that have been with my family for generations have had less children than past. You can live without this, I know, but I would offer a good deal more profit than you earn now, and for easier work." "What of our home?" "Keep it. Send funds to your mother, so she needn't work." Levi looked up until he found Joshua's mother, green eyes sparkling. "She's got a heart like my love's, all for her family, and willing to do anything." "We all love that," Joshua chuckled. "But she's earned a rest, I think." Levi grinned. "Think on it. We've told no one, so the openings won't be filled quickly, but tell me if you wish it." He nodded and turned to leave. Then Joshua caught his good arm and pulled him into an awkward embrace, turning to keep the drum around his neck from being between them. Joshua chuckled and pulled them apart. "A week ago I shot you and carted you naked through the woods. Now you'll be my man." Joshua looked playfully from under his brow with a smirk. "You go too far." Then they laughed, and a wave of cheers slowly rolled out of the center of town. He shouted his thanks over the mounting roar and shoved Levi away so he could take his place with his family before Joshua's brother leaned in close. "Who was that?" he shouted over the roar as everyone readied their drums. Joshua found him, the eldest and quietest, and smiled with a playful shrug. "He's my friend." He chuckled, then took up his sticks and joined the crowd in the simple repeating rhythm of Feet on the March, finding his mother as she smiled wide and joined the song, laughing at his youngest sister. He wondered if she'd like the idea of them all taking care of her, or if it would drive her mad. But Levi'd been right. She'd earned a rest. 12 drummers drumming, 11 pipers piping, 10 lords a-leaping, 9 ladies dancing, 8 maids a-milking, 7 swans a-swimming, 6 geese a-laying, 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree.